Imagine a world vastly different from our own, a time when life's most fundamental experiences were fraught with unimaginable peril, especially for women. Have you ever truly considered what daily existence was like for them back in the year 1160? Prepare to have your understanding of human resilience and hardship completely redefined. Number 10. The inescapable shadow of childbirth. Picture a young woman, perhaps barely into her 20s, as her body strains in the tiny, smoke-filled hovel she calls home. The year is 1160, and for her, like countless others, the greatest journey of her life is not across distant lands, but through the harrowing passages of childbirth. This was not merely an event, it was a life-threatening ordeal, a constant, looming shadow that touched every woman from the lowliest serf to the highest noblewoman. It was a lottery of life and death played out repeatedly throughout a woman's fertile years, often beginning with her first pregnancy shortly after an arranged marriage, which could happen as young as 12 years old. The concept of pain management, as we understand it, simply did not exist. There were no epidurals, no gentle reassurances from a doctor, no sterile environments. Instead, there was raw, unmitigated agony, endured in silence or with cries that echoed only within the walls of a cramped dwelling, often with little more than a handful of women to assist. The statistics, if they had been recorded with modern precision, would be staggering. Historians who have meticulously studied medieval life, drawing from fragmented records and archaeological findings, suggest that a significant percentage of women died during or shortly after childbirth. Estimates vary, but some scholars propose that as many as 1 in 4 pregnancies could result in the death of the mother. Think about that for a moment. Every time a woman conceived, she was staring down a 1 in 4 chance of losing her own life, and this often happened not once but multiple times. A woman might endure 5, 6, 10, or even more pregnancies in her lifetime, each one a fresh gamble with mortality. The reasons for these devastating outcomes were numerous and interconnected, forming a web of peril from which escape was rare. One primary culprit was infection. Imagine a birth taking place on a straw mattress, perhaps on the floor of a peasant's hut. The hands assisting the birth, usually those of an older woman or a local midwife, were almost certainly not washed with any understanding of hygiene. There was no concept of antiseptic, no knowledge of microscopic bacteria. Open wounds from tearing during labor, combined with unsanitary conditions, were an open invitation for virulent infections like puerperal fever, often called childbed fever. These infections would ravage the mother's body, leading to raging fevers, extreme pain, and a rapid descent into death, all while her family could do little more than watch and pray. Records from monastic infirmaries, though scarce, sometimes hint at the rapid decline of women admitted with symptoms consistent with severe post-childbirth infection. Then there was the sheer physical exhaustion and trauma. Labor could last for days, draining a woman's strength completely. Without medical intervention for complications like prolonged or obstructed labor, a baby stuck in the birth canal often meant a tragic end for both mother and child. Malnutrition, especially among peasant women, further weakened their bodies, making them less able to withstand the incredible strain of childbirth. Their diets were often monotonous and deficient in essential nutrients, leaving them vulnerable and less resilient than someone with a balanced modern diet. Scholars like Dr. Philippa Gregory, through her fictionalized yet deeply researched accounts, often highlight the physical toll taken on women during this period, grounded in historical reality. Furthermore, medical knowledge was rudimentary at best. Midwives, while experienced, operated on a mix of inherited wisdom, superstition, and practical observation. They understood the mechanics of birth to some extent, but they had no understanding of internal anatomy, no surgical tools for emergencies, and no knowledge of vital signs beyond basic observation. If a baby was breech, or if the mother experienced excessive bleeding, there was little to no effective medical recourse. The very concept of a cesarean section was almost universally fatal for the mother, only performed in desperate, last-ditch attempts, often on a dying woman to save the baby if possible, and usually only after the mother had passed away. Superstition also played a significant role in the approach to childbirth. Many believed that difficult births were a sign of sin or the work of malevolent spirits. Charms, prayers, and sometimes strange concoctions were offered to ease labor, alongside practical support. While these practices might have offered psychological comfort, they did nothing to address the underlying physiological dangers. Women might pray to saints like Margaret of Antioch, who was considered a patron saint of childbirth, hoping for divine intervention where earthly remedies failed. Church, while providing spiritual guidance, also sometimes reinforced the idea that childbirth was a divine punishment for Eve's sin, further embedding a sense of fatalism around the process. The emotional toll on a woman who survived one perilous birth only to face another was immense. Imagine the anxiety and fear that must have accompanied each subsequent pregnancy, knowing the risks she had barely escaped before. For those who lost infants, which was also incredibly common, the grief would have been profound, yet quickly overshadowed by the pressures of daily life and the expectation to try again. Infant mortality rates were astronomically high, with perhaps half of all children not surviving past their 5th birthday. So even if a mother survived the birth, her struggle was far from over. She then faced the daunting task of nurturing a fragile life through its most vulnerable years, often without adequate nutrition, warmth, or medical care for her child. For noble women, while they might have had access to slightly better conditions and perhaps a wet nurse to ease the burden of feeding, the core risks of childbirth remained unchanged. The lack of medical understanding permeated all levels of society. Indeed, the pressure on noble women to produce heirs, particularly male ones, could be even more intense, leading to a relentless cycle of pregnancies until a surviving son was born, or until the woman's body simply gave out. Queen Matilda, wife of King Henry I, endured numerous pregnancies, and while she was a queen, she was still subject to the same physical limitations and risks as any other woman of her time. Her own daughter, Matilda the Empress, survived her own difficult childbirths, but many noble women in her lineage did not. The high mortality rates among royalty in genealogies of the period serve as a stark reminder that wealth offered little protection against the fundamental dangers of biology. The very act of womanhood in 1160 was intrinsically linked to the terrifying reality of childbirth. It was a rite of passage, a duty, and a constant threat that loomed over every marriage and every fertile year. This was not a rare tragedy. It was a common, accepted part of life, shaping societal expectations, family structures, and individual destinies in a way we can scarcely comprehend today. Number 9, lifelong toil and relentless physical labor. Imagine waking before dawn, not to the gentle hum of an alarm clock, but to the demanding rhythms of the natural world. For women in 1160, whether in a smoky peasant hovel or a bustling castle, life was an unending cycle of physical exertion. There was no concept of leisure time as we understand it, no weekend breaks, no retirement. From the moment the sun began to paint the sky, until long after it had dipped below the horizon, a woman's hands, back, and feet were in constant motion, performing tasks that would exhaust even the most robust modern individual. This was not just work, it was a way of life, a fundamental component of survival, and it left little room for rest or personal pursuit. The sheer quantity and variety of physical labor women endured day in and day out is almost incomprehensible in our automated world. Consider the life of a peasant woman who represented the vast majority of the female population. Her day began with preparing the morning meal, often a simple pottage, over an open fire. This involved fetching water from the communal well or river, a task that might require multiple trips with heavy buckets, perhaps over uneven, muddy ground. Then came the endless work of the household, sweeping earthen floors, tending to any small livestock like chickens or a pig, and ensuring the fire was kept burning for warmth and cooking. But her work extended far beyond the confines of the dwelling. Women were indispensable partners in agricultural labor. They would join their husbands and fathers in the fields, sowing seeds in the spring, weeding throughout the summer, and harvesting crops in the autumn. Imagine bending over for hours, pulling weeds from the soil, or swinging a sickle in the hot sun, the coarse cloth of their garments scratching against their skin. Records from manorial estates, such as those found in the Domesday Book surveys and later extents, reveal the collective labor expected from entire households, with women playing a crucial role in these communal agricultural endeavors. Beyond the fields, there was the monumental task of transforming raw materials into necessities. Women were the primary producers of cloth and clothing. This process was incredibly labor-intensive. First, raw wool or flax had to be cleaned, carded, and prepared. Then came the spinning, often done on a drop spindle, a continuous motion of drawing out and twisting fibers into thread. This could occupy every spare moment, even while walking or tending children. A single garment, from raw wool to finished tunic, could take weeks or months of dedicated effort. Dr. Marianne Kowalski, a prominent historian of medieval economy, emphasizes the central role of women in the textile production of the era, noting its critical importance to household economies. After spinning, the threads had to be woven on a loom, a process that required strength and precision. Finally, the cloth would be cut and sewn by hand, often with crude needles and thread, into practical garments for the entire family. Every stitch was a testament to hours of demanding labor. Food preparation was another Herculean effort. Before refrigeration, every meal was a journey from raw ingredients to sustenance. Grain had to be ground into flour, a task often done at a communal mill, but sometimes by hand with a quern stone, an incredibly strenuous activity. Baking bread, brewing ale, preserving meat through salting or smoking, drying fruits and vegetables, these were all daily or seasonal chores that demanded significant physical strength and time. Imagine stirring a massive cauldron over an open fire for hours to make soap or render fat, or kneading dough for the family's bread, day after day. The scent of wood smoke was perpetually in their hair and clothing. Even for noblewomen, life was far from an idle existence. While they might not have worked in the fields, they were responsible for managing vast households, which was a monumental undertaking. A noble lady oversaw dozens, sometimes hundreds, of servants. This meant ensuring the smooth operation of the kitchen, the pantry, the laundry, the brewing, the spinning, and the weaving within the castle walls. She would oversee the preparation of feasts, the care of the sick, and the education of her children. This required constant supervision, delegation, and often direct involvement in tasks. Records of castle accounts and household roles, like those from a leaner of Aquitaine's court, detail the enormous scale of daily operations that a lady of the castle would have been expected to manage, demanding significant organizational skill and physical presence. She would be on her feet for hours, moving through the castle, inspecting, instructing, and ensuring everything functioned according to her lord's expectations. Child rearing was integrated into this physical labor. Babies were carried on hips or backs while mothers worked. Children were taught skills from a young age, and the constant demands of feeding, cleaning, and comforting young ones were added to an already overflowing schedule. There was no separate childcare as a distinct activity. It was woven into the fabric of daily toil. Bodies of these women, from constant bending, lifting, carrying, and repetitive motions, would have aged rapidly, becoming stiff and worn long before their time. Arthritis and other musculoskeletal ailments would have been common afflictions. Their hands, calloused and rough, bore the marks of a life lived entirely through physical effort. The sheer endurance required, day after day, year after year, until old age or illness finally brought a halt, speaks volumes about the demanding reality of their lives. Number 8, lack of control over their own lives. Imagine waking up one day to discover that your entire future has already been decided for you, not by you. In 1160, for women across all social strata, personal autonomy was largely a foreign concept. From the moment of their birth, a woman's destiny was inextricably linked to the decisions of the men in her life, her father, her brothers, and eventually her husband. She had little to no say in the most fundamental choices that would shape her existence, from who she would marry to where she would live, and even what would happen to her own body and property. This pervasive lack of control defined much of a woman's reality and was a deeply ingrained aspect of medieval society, rooted in legal custom, religious doctrine, and social norms. The most significant decision made for a woman was her marriage. For the vast majority, marriages were arranged, not for love or personal preference, but for strategic advantage. Peasant families, a marriage might solidify landholdings, create alliances between families, or simply ensure the continuation of labor on the lord's manor. For noble families, the stakes were even higher. Marriages were powerful political tools, forging alliances between powerful families, consolidating wealth, and securing dynastic lines. A young noblewoman might be betrothed as a child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, to a man she had never met, someone significantly older or from a distant land. Feelings were irrelevant. Her duty was to obey and to serve the political and economic interests of her family. Records from the era, such as charters and feudal rolls, frequently detail marriage agreements where the transfer of a daughter is clearly laid out alongside lands and titles, underscoring her status as a valuable asset rather than an individual with agency. Once married, a woman's legal identity effectively merged with that of her husband. Under the common law, known as coverture, a married woman had virtually no independent legal standing. She could not own property in her own name, make contracts, or represent herself in court without her husband's permission or involvement. Any property she brought into the marriage, known as her dowry, became her husband's to manage, though it was theoretically meant to provide for her in widowhood. This meant that a woman's financial security was entirely dependent on her husband's goodwill and economic prudence. If he was irresponsible, or if he died without adequate provision, a widow could find herself in dire straits. Historical legal treatises from the period, like Glanvill's treatise on the laws and customs of the Kingdom of England, outline these strictures, clearly defining the subordinate legal status of wives. Even her body was largely considered her husband's property. Marital consent, as understood today, was not a concept that was widely recognized, especially in the context of marriage consummation. A wife's primary duty was to produce heirs, particularly male ones, and her refusal to fulfill this duty could be seen as grounds for annulment or even desertion. The expectation of obedience was absolute. In an age where patriarchal structures were paramount, a husband's authority over his wife was almost unquestioned, often reinforced by religious teachings that emphasized male headship within the family. What options existed for a woman who did not wish to marry or wished to escape a terrible marriage? They were vanishingly few. Entering a convent was one of the only avenues for a woman to gain some degree of independence and intellectual pursuit. Within monastic walls, women could own property collectively, pursue scholarship, and exercise authority within their enclosed communities. However, this path was often reserved for daughters of noble families who had the means to provide a dowry to the convent, or for those whose families chose it for them for various reasons, not necessarily out of personal calling. Leaving a marriage was even more difficult. Divorce was almost impossible, as marriage was considered a sacrament by the Church, indissoluble, except under very rare circumstances, such as proof of pre-existing, unconsummated betrothal to another. Annulment, while rare, required substantial proof of specific impediments, and even then, did not mean freedom from societal expectations or financial security. Even in widowhood, a woman's control remained tenuous. While a widow might regain some legal standing and control over her dowry and dower lands, a portion of her husband's land set aside for her support, she was often under pressure to remarry, particularly if she was young or if her lands were valuable. Children, especially male heirs, might be removed from her care and placed under the guardianship of male relatives or the feudal lord, further diminishing her influence and direct control over her own family. The lives of widowed noblewomen, while sometimes affording more agency than married women, were often still fraught with the strategic calculations of powerful men. The cumulative effect of this lack of control was a pervasive sense of powerlessness. Women in 1160 lived in a world where their voices were rarely heard, their opinions often disregarded, and their futures determined by forces beyond their reach. Their value was primarily tied to their reproductive capacity, their ability to perform labor, and their usefulness in solidifying social and economic alliances. This fundamental lack of agency colored every aspect of their existence, shaping their daily experiences in ways that are deeply challenging for us to fully grasp today. Number 7, poor hygiene and rampant disease. Imagine living in a world where the air itself felt thick with unseen dangers, where every open wound was a potential death sentence, and where the most basic concepts of cleanliness were utterly unknown. This was the reality for women in 1160, a daily existence steeped in conditions that would horrify and sicken us today. Poor hygiene was not just a matter of discomfort. It was a constant, insidious threat that led to rampant disease and significantly shortened lifespans. From the water they drank to the very air they breathed, women navigated an environment teeming with invisible enemies, with no scientific understanding to guide them toward healthier practices. Clean water, a commodity we often take for granted, was a luxury for most. Water sources were frequently contaminated. People relied on communal wells, rivers, or streams that also served as dumping grounds for waste, both human and animal. Imagine drawing water from a river where upstream, animals grazed and human waste was discarded, or from a well that was shallow and prone to contamination from surface runoff. Drinking this water, often unfiltered or untreated, was a daily gamble with one's health. Diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid, all caused by contaminated water, were common scourges, leading to debilitating illness and often death, especially among the young and the old. Chronic dehydration and weakness from such illnesses further compromised a woman's ability to perform her endless daily chores or survive childbirth. Historical accounts, such as the chronicles detailing outbreaks of flux or bloody flux, point to widespread gastrointestinal diseases that were endemic in medieval communities. Personal hygiene was also a concept understood very differently. Regular bathing was rare, and when it did occur, it was often in communal bathhouses or in large wooden tubs shared by many family members, with the same water used for all. Soap, if available, was a harsh lye mixture, far removed from the gentle cleansing agents of today. Most people simply went without. Imagine the constant grime, the persistent odors, the itchiness from parasites like lice and fleas that were an inescapable part of daily life. Clothing was rarely washed and often worn until it literally disintegrated. Undergarments were either non-existent or minimal. This constant exposure to dirt and parasites led to skin infections, persistent itching, and the spread of disease. Sanitation was virtually non-existent by modern standards. There were no flushing toilets, no sewage system. Human and animal waste was often simply discarded into streets, rivers, or cesspits. In towns and cities, narrow lanes would be choked with refuse, attracting vermin and creating a putrid stench. Even within homes, chamber pots would be emptied outside, often directly into gardens or communal middens. Imagine the flies, the rats, the constant exposure to pathogens from decaying matter. The air itself, particularly in urban areas, would have been heavy with the stench of human and animal waste, stale smoke from fires, and unwashed bodies. Such conditions were breeding grounds for disease. The historian Barbara W. Tuchman, in A Distant Mirror, vividly describes the foulness of medieval towns, noting the pervasive presence of waste and its implications for public health. Homes themselves offered little refuge. Peasant dwellings were often small, dark, and poorly ventilated, with open fires filling the air with smoke and soot. Animals might share living quarters with families, adding to the unsanitary conditions and potential for disease transmission. Noble castles, while grander, were not much cleaner. Drafty stone structures were difficult to heat and clean, and private latrines often emptied directly into moats or rivers below, contributing to the overall unsanitary environment. Constant exposure to smoke from cooking fires inside poorly ventilated homes would have led to chronic respiratory problems, such as asthma and bronchitis, further weakening women's health. The cumulative effect of these unsanitary conditions was a population constantly battling illness. Fevers, coughs, debilitating stomach ailments, and skin diseases were everyday occurrences. The understanding of disease transmission was based on miasma theory, the belief that bad air or foul smells caused illness, rather than invisible germs. This meant that efforts to prevent disease were largely ineffective. Women, who spent much of their lives managing household environments and caring for the sick, were particularly vulnerable. They bore the brunt of caring for ill family members, often without understanding how to prevent their own infection or the spread of the illness. A simple cold could quickly escalate into pneumonia, a minor cut could become a fatal infection, and a common stomach upset could lead to dehydration and death. The pervasive nature of disease, combined with a complete lack of effective medical remedies, meant that life was lived on a knife edge, with health constantly under siege. Number 6. Limited dietary options and constant hunger. Imagine a life where every meal is a variation on the same few ingredients, where the concept of diverse nutrition is utterly alien, and where the gnawing ache of hunger is a familiar companion, particularly during the lean months. For women in 1160, across all social strata, the availability and variety of food were severely constrained, and for the vast majority, the specter of hunger was a persistent reality. This wasn't just about dissatisfaction. It was about survival, about having enough calories and nutrients to perform the relentless physical labor that defined their days and to bring new life into the world. Their diet was dictated by the seasons, the whims of the weather, and the rigid social hierarchy, leaving little room for choice or abundance. Peasant women, the foundation of their diet was grain, primarily barley, rye, or oats, cooked into a thick pottage or baked into coarse bread. This might be supplemented with whatever vegetables could be grown in a small garden patch: cabbages, onions, leeks, or peas. Meat was a rare luxury, perhaps available only on feast days or when an animal was culled. If they were lucky, they might have access to wild game or fish, but this was often restricted by feudal lords. Dairy products like cheese and milk from a cow or goat were also part of the diet, offering crucial fat and protein. But imagine consuming almost the same meal, day after day, year after year, a gruel of grain, perhaps some vegetables, and dark, heavy bread. This monotonous diet, while providing sustenance, often lacked essential vitamins and minerals. Records from manorial accounts frequently detail the distribution of grain and other staples to peasant families, showing the limited range of foodstuffs available to them. The concept of constant hunger needs to be understood not just as a sudden, acute starvation, but as a chronic state of low-level deprivation. There were lean months, particularly in late winter and early spring, before the new harvests came in, when food supplies dwindled dramatically. During these times, people would stretch their meager stores, often eating less than their bodies required, leading to weakness, susceptibility to illness, and a diminished capacity for work. Imagine the constant worry of not having enough to feed your children, of seeing their bellies swell from malnutrition or their bones become fragile. Fear of famine was a very real, annual anxiety, constantly lurking on the horizon. Bad harvest due to prolonged rain, drought, or pest infestation could plunge entire communities into crisis, leading to widespread starvation. Chroniclers like William of Malmesbury occasionally mention periods of severe scarcity, highlighting the precariousness of food supply. Even for noblewomen, while certainly not facing starvation, their dietary options were still limited compared to modern standards. Their meals would include more meat, often roasted or stewed, and finer bread made from wheat. They would also have access to more spices, wines, and perhaps more diverse vegetables from castle gardens. However, fresh fruits and vegetables were still seasonal, and many modern staples were simply non-existent. Potatoes, tomatoes, and corn, for example, would not arrive in Europe for centuries. Their diet, while richer in protein and fats, could still lack certain nutrients, and the methods of food preparation, often involving heavy salting and boiling, could deplete vitamins. Furthermore, the sheer quantity of food consumed at feasts by the nobility often led to other health issues, such as gout. The elaborate display of food at a noble table was often more about demonstrating wealth and status than providing balanced nutrition. Processing and preservation of food added another layer of hardship. Without refrigeration, food had to be consumed quickly or preserved through laborious methods like salting, smoking, or drying. This meant a constant cycle of preparation to prevent spoilage, which was another demanding chore for women. Imagine spending hours salting and drying fish or meat to ensure your family had protein through the winter, or brewing ale to provide a safer drink than potentially contaminated water. This preservation work was vital, but relentlessly time-consuming. Pregnant and nursing women, the limited diet was particularly perilous. The nutritional demands of carrying a child and then breastfeeding were immense, and a diet lacking in essential vitamins, iron, and protein would have severely impacted both mother and child. Malnutrition in mothers contributed to difficult births, weakened immune systems, and higher rates of infant mortality. A mother lacking sufficient nourishment herself would struggle to produce enough nutritious milk for her infant, leading to stunted growth and poor health in the next generation. The cycle of poor diet and its consequences was a harsh reality passed down through generations. Constant low-level hunger and dietary deficiencies were not just an inconvenience. They were a pervasive, underlying stressor that fundamentally shaped the physical well-being and daily struggles of women in 1160. Number 5. The shadow of disease and early death. Imagine living in a world where a minor cough could swiftly escalate into a fatal illness, where childbirth carried the same risks as a battlefield, and where the constant presence of unseen killers meant that few would ever reach old age. For women in 1160, the shadow of disease and early death was an inescapable, ever-present reality. There was no understanding of germs, no vaccines, no antibiotics, and medical treatments were often based on superstition or ineffective herbal remedies. Every scrape, every fever, every seasonal illness was a gamble, and the odds were stacked against them. Their lives were often tragically cut short, leaving behind families and unfulfilled potential. The most common killers were infectious diseases. Dysentery, influenza, smallpox, measles, and various fevers swept through communities with terrifying regularity. These were not isolated incidents, but recurrent epidemics that could decimate populations. Imagine an entire village succumbing to a virulent flu, or seeing loved ones waste away from smallpox, their bodies covered in pustules, with absolutely no effective way to stop its spread or alleviate the suffering. Women, constantly interacting with their families in close quarters, caring for the sick and handling food, were particularly vulnerable to contagion. Historians like Joseph Bion detail the devastating impact of recurrent epidemics throughout the medieval period, showing how frequently communities were ravaged. The lack of understanding about disease transmission meant that people unknowingly facilitated the spread of illness. Unsanitary conditions, as explored earlier, ensured that pathogens thrived. Contaminated water, unwashed hands, and the close proximity of people and livestock created ideal breeding grounds for sickness. When someone fell ill, the lack of isolation measures meant the disease often spread rapidly through the household and then the community. Women, as primary caregivers, would often spend days and nights tending to sick family members, inadvertently exposing themselves to the same deadly pathogens. This selfless act of care, vital for comfort, often put their own lives at extreme risk. Childhood diseases, now largely preventable through vaccination, were widespread and often fatal. Measles, mumps, rubella, and whooping cough frequently claimed the lives of infants and young children. Imagine surviving the perils of childbirth, only to watch your child succumb to a fever or a cough that today would be easily treatable. The high infant and child mortality rates meant that few families remained untouched by the profound grief of losing a child, sometimes multiple children, to illnesses that are barely a footnote in modern medicine. This constant cycle of loss would have left an indelible mark on the psyche of women, making them acutely aware of the fragility of life. Even seemingly minor ailments could become life-threatening. A simple cut or scrape could lead to a deadly infection, as there were no antiseptics or antibiotics. Imagine a splinter causing a festering wound, or a minor burn becoming gangrenous, leading to a slow, agonizing death. Teeth problems, common due to their coarse diet and lack of dental hygiene, could lead to painful abscesses and systemic infections. Chronic conditions like tuberculosis, often called consumption, slowly withered individuals, causing coughing, weakness, and eventual death over months or years. Constant damp and cold in their homes, combined with poor nutrition, made them susceptible to respiratory infections, which could quickly turn fatal, especially during the harsh winters. Medical practitioners, such as they were, had limited knowledge and even fewer effective tools. Physicians, often educated through ancient texts, relied on theories like the balance of humors, and treatments might involve bloodletting, purging, or herbal concoctions that were often ineffective or even harmful. Surgeons were rare, and their procedures were agonizingly painful and prone to infection. For the average woman, medical care meant relying on local remedies, the wisdom of an older woman or a village healer, or perhaps a visit to a monastic infirmary if one was nearby. These options offered little defense against the most virulent diseases. The lack of proper anatomical understanding meant that internal conditions or complications were often a mystery. The reality of early death shaped every aspect of a woman's life. Marriages were often short-lived due to the early death of a spouse, leading to cycles of remarriage and stepfamilies. Children grew up knowing that their parents, siblings, or friends could be snatched away at any moment by an unseen enemy. Life expectancies were low, often in the late 20s or early 30s for women, significantly impacted by the risks of childbirth and the constant threat of disease. While some individuals certainly lived longer, these were exceptions rather than the norm. This pervasive awareness of mortality instilled a deep sense of fatalism, but also perhaps a desperate appreciation for the fleeting moments of health and survival. The shadow of disease and early death was not just a theoretical concept. It was a daily, terrifying companion, an invisible executioner that claimed countless lives. Number 4, living in a world of constant violence and danger. Imagine a world where the concept of a safe, ordered society was often tenuous, where physical violence was a common resolution to disputes, and where women, largely unprotected by law enforcement, were particularly vulnerable. For women in 1160, life unfolded in a climate of constant, lurking danger, not just from disease or hunger, but from the direct threat of human violence. This wasn't merely the distant clash of armies. It was a more intimate, pervasive threat that manifested in various forms, from the casual brutality of domestic life to the terrifying chaos of warfare and banditry. Their vulnerability was a defining feature of their existence, shaping their movements, their fears, and their daily interactions. One significant source of danger was the inherent violence of feudal society itself. Loyalty was often personal, and conflicts between lords, petty skirmishes, and full-scale wars were frequent occurrences. When armies or raiding parties swept through the countryside, women were often among the primary victims. They faced the terror of home invasions, the destruction of their livelihoods, and the very real threat of abduction, assault, or death. Village chronicles and monastic records sometimes hint at the devastation wrought by such conflicts, where the lives of ordinary people, especially women, were uprooted and shattered. Imagine the fear every time news of a nearby skirmish reached your village, or the sight of approaching armed men, knowing the terrible fate that might await you and your family. The absence of a strong centralized government and widespread, effective law enforcement meant that protection was often localized and inconsistent. Beyond open warfare, banditry was a constant menace. Unruly knights, desperate men, or disbanded soldiers often roamed the land, preying on travelers and isolated settlements. For women who might need to travel to a market, a mill, or visit relatives in a nearby village, even a short journey carried significant risk. There were no secure roads, no police patrols. Imagine walking through a dense forest or along a deserted track, constantly scanning your surroundings, knowing that at any moment you could encounter robbers or worse. The vulnerability of women traveling alone, or even in small groups, was immense. Feudal lords might offer some protection within their direct sphere of influence, but outside those boundaries, the world was often lawless and dangerous. Perhaps the most insidious form of violence was that which occurred within the domestic sphere. In a highly patriarchal society, where a husband's authority was almost absolute, domestic abuse was undoubtedly widespread, though rarely recorded. Women had little legal recourse to escape abusive relationships. The church, while advocating for peace and condemning violence, often reinforced the wife's duty of obedience, and the legal system provided minimal protection. Imagine being trapped in a marriage where physical violence was a daily reality, with no means of escape, no sympathetic ear, and no understanding of rights or safety. The notion of marital rape, for example, was completely alien to the legal and social framework of the time. The very structure of society often left women exposed to the potential for brutal treatment from those who were meant to protect them. Even for noble women, life in a castle was not entirely safe. While generally protected from common brigands, they lived in an environment where male honor was fiercely defended, often with violence. Noble women might be targets of political abduction, forced marriage, or held hostage in times of conflict. Constant threat of sieges meant that even castle walls offered no absolute guarantee of safety. Records of medieval conflicts frequently describe the fate of besieged castles, where women, alongside children, faced starvation, disease, and the ultimate horror of capture or slaughter if the walls were breached. The fragility of peace and the ever-present potential for armed conflict underscored the precariousness of their existence, even within the supposed safety of fortified strongholds. Pervasive fear of violence shaped women's daily lives in tangible ways. It limited their mobility, especially outside their immediate community. It instilled a sense of caution and vigilance in every interaction. It fostered a reliance on male protectors, further solidifying the patriarchal power structures. For those who directly experienced violence, whether in warfare or in their own homes, the physical and psychological scars would have been profound and lifelong, with no support systems or understanding of trauma recovery. The reality of living in a world where physical security was never guaranteed added an immense layer of burden to the already challenging lives of women in 1160. Number 3, limited education and intellectual stimulation. Imagine a life where the vast libraries of human knowledge, the vibrant discussions of philosophy, and the intricate beauty of written words were almost entirely inaccessible to you. For the vast majority of women in 1160, education in any formal sense was a luxury, if it existed at all. Their intellectual world was circumscribed by the immediate demands of daily life, their roles in the household, and the limited oral traditions of their communities. This wasn't merely a lack of opportunity, it was a systemic exclusion that profoundly shaped their perspectives, their contributions to society, and their ability to engage with the wider world. Their minds, often sharp and capable, were rarely given the tools to flourish beyond practical wisdom. Peasant women, the idea of formal schooling was utterly non-existent. Their education was entirely practical, learned through observation and participation in the endless chores of the household and the fields. Girl learned to spin, weave, cook, bake, tend to animals, and care for younger siblings by watching and assisting her mother and other older women. She absorbed the traditions, superstitions, and oral histories of her village. Her world was intensely local, and her knowledge was focused on survival and the maintenance of her immediate family. Reading and writing were skills as distant and irrelevant as the stars to most of them. Their literacy was not in letters, but in the rhythms of the seasons, the language of the hearth, and the unspoken duties of communal life. Even for women of the burgeoning merchant class in towns, formal education was rare. They might learn basic arithmetic for trade, or perhaps some literacy if they were involved in managing their family's business, but this was the exception rather than the rule. Their education, too, focused on practical skills necessary for their economic roles, managing a shop, handling accounts, or overseeing craft production. There were no public schools for girls, and private tutors were reserved for the elite. The concept of intellectual development for its own sake, apart from religious instruction, was not widely considered important for women. For noblewomen, the situation was slightly different, but still highly constrained. While some noble daughters might receive an education, it was primarily focused on specific skills deemed appropriate for their station. This might include literacy in Latin or French, basic arithmetic for household management, sometimes music or needlework, and always instruction in piety and aristocratic manners. A noblewoman needed to be able to read religious texts, manage complex household accounts, and entertain guests appropriately. However, the depth of this education rarely extended to theology, law, or classical philosophy, subjects typically reserved for men destined for the church or high political office. Historical figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine were exceptional for their extensive education and intellectual curiosity, but they stood out precisely because they were so unusual for their time. The majority of noblewomen, while literate, were not encouraged to pursue intellectual paths that challenged societal norms or ventured far beyond their prescribed roles. The primary avenue for advanced learning for women was the convent. Within monastic communities, women could indeed achieve high levels of literacy, study theological texts, copy manuscripts, and even produce their own literary and scholarly works. Abbesses often managed significant estates and demonstrated considerable administrative and intellectual prowess. However, this path was exclusive, open only to those who chose, or were chosen for, a religious life, often requiring a dowry. It was a choice that meant renouncing marriage and secular life, and thus was not a path available or desired by the vast majority of women. For many noble families, sending a daughter to a convent was also a practical solution for a surplus daughter for whom a suitable marriage could not be found, rather than a testament to a desire for her intellectual fulfillment. The lack of widespread education meant that women were largely excluded from public life, from legal professions, from political debate, and from the creation of written history. Their voices, their perspectives, and their intellectual contributions are thus largely absent from the formal records of the period, making it challenging for modern historians to fully grasp their inner lives and thoughts. The intellectual stimulation we take for granted, books, diverse media, access to countless opinions and facts, was simply not available. Their world was often narrow, defined by the immediate physical and social environment, with little opportunity for intellectual exploration or engagement with ideas beyond the practical and the religious. This limitation was not just about what they knew, but about the very horizons of their minds and the opportunities they were denied. Number 2, the burden of constant cold and discomfort. Imagine a life where the biting chill seeps into your bones, where warmth is a fleeting luxury, and where personal comfort, as we understand it, is a distant dream. For women in 1160, surviving the cold and enduring pervasive discomfort was a constant, draining battle. Their homes offered meager protection against the elements, their clothing provided inadequate insulation, and the very act of existing often meant shivering through long winters and bearing countless minor physical irritations. This wasn't merely an inconvenience, it was a daily drain on their energy, a source of chronic health issues, and a pervasive element of their harsh physical reality. Consider the homes they inhabited. Peasant women dwellings were typically small, single-room huts, often made of wattle and daub, a mixture of woven branches and mud, with a thatched roof. These structures offered little insulation against the driving rain, the biting winds, or the deep snows of winter. Imagine the dampness permeating everything, the chills seeping through the walls, and the drafts whistling through every crevice. There were no glass windows, only wooden shutters or perhaps small openings covered with animal bladders or oiled cloth, which let in little light and offered minimal protection. The main source of heat was an open hearth in the center of the room, with smoke often escaping through a hole in the roof, or sometimes just seeping out through the door and eaves. This meant the air was frequently smoky, irritating lungs and eyes, and the warmth, what little there was, tended to rise and escape, leaving the lower parts of the room, where people slept and lived, perpetually cold. Chronic respiratory issues from the smoke and damp would have been common. Even in noble castles, the situation, while grander in scale, was far from comfortable by modern standards. Castles were massive, stone structures, inherently difficult to heat. Fireplaces, while larger and more numerous than in peasant homes, often produced more smoke than effective warmth, especially in sprawling halls. The stone walls would retain the cold, radiating it inwards. Imagine drafts constantly sweeping through large, ill-fitting doors and unglazed window openings. Sleeping in a castle often meant bundling up in thick woolens and furs, even indoors, as the cold penetrated deep into the chambers. The concept of a comfortable, uniformly heated room was centuries away. Cold also made everything else harder: washing, cooking, drying clothes, and simply moving around. Accounts of medieval life often mention the pervasive cold, even in the grandest residences during winter months. Clothing, while layered, was heavy and often coarse. Wool was the primary material, scratchy against the skin, and notoriously slow to dry once wet. There was no lightweight, insulating material, no waterproof outer shell. Imagine being out in the fields in wet, cold weather, with heavy, damp woolen clothing clinging to your body, slowly chilling you to the bone. Drying these garments was a major undertaking, especially in damp conditions, and often meant enduring continued discomfort. Footwear was basic, often simple leather shoes or boots, offering little protection against mud, dampness, or extreme cold. Chilblains, frostbite, and chronic foot ailments would have been common. Beyond the direct cold, there was the pervasive discomfort stemming from the lack of basic amenities. Beds were often straw mattresses on wooden frames, hard and prone to harboring vermin. Blankets were woolen or rough hides. There were no soft pillows, no plush carpets. Sitting on cold stone benches or rough wooden stools was common. Personal hygiene was rudimentary, as discussed earlier, leading to constant itching from parasites and the general unpleasantness of being unclean. There was no instant hot water, no comforting warmth from a central heating system, no readily available way to escape the physical unpleasantness of their environment. Physical strain of constant cold and discomfort added another layer of burden to the already physically demanding lives of women. It drained their energy, making every task more arduous. It contributed to widespread illness, particularly respiratory infections and joint problems like arthritis, which would have been exacerbated by the damp and cold. Constant battle against the elements was not just about survival. It was about maintaining a basic level of functionality in a world that offered little in the way of reprieve from the relentless chill. Quiet endurance of this persistent discomfort was a testament to the sheer resilience required to simply exist in 1160. Number 1. Social isolation and limited mobility. Imagine a life where your entire world stretched no further than a few miles in any direction, where familiar faces were the only ones you ever saw, and where the concept of traveling to a distant city or even a neighboring region was an extraordinary, perhaps even impossible, dream. For the vast majority of women in 1160, social isolation and severely limited mobility were fundamental aspects of their existence. Their lives were tightly circumscribed by the boundaries of their village, their lord's manor, or their castle walls, creating a remarkably insular existence with little opportunity for outside experiences or diverse social interaction. This was not merely a matter of personal preference. It was dictated by economic necessity, social custom, and the very real dangers of travel in a pre-modern world. Peasant women, life revolved almost entirely around their immediate community. Born, living, and often dying within the same village or hamlet, their social circle consisted of family members, fellow villagers, and perhaps the local priest. Their world was intensely local, focused on the immediate demands of their agricultural labor and the social rhythms of their small community. Imagine never meeting anyone from outside your village, save for perhaps a traveling merchant or a tax collector. Marriage, as discussed, could sometimes involve moving to a neighboring village, but this was still a short distance, a journey perhaps of only a few hours. The concept of visiting or tourism was utterly alien. Travel was undertaken out of necessity, to a market, to a mill, or for religious pilgrimage, and even these short journeys were fraught with the dangers of banditry or difficult terrain. Records from manorial courts often show disputes between villagers, indicating the intense and sometimes strained social dynamics within these close-knit, isolated communities. Even for noblewomen, while they might have a wider social sphere than peasants, their mobility was still incredibly limited by modern standards. Their lives revolved around the castle or manor house of their lord. While noblewomen might travel between their families' estates or accompany their husbands on campaigns or court visits, these journeys were arduous, slow, and often dangerous. They involved traveling by horse or cart over poor roads, facing the elements, and relying on insecure lodgings. Such journeys were not taken lightly and were primarily for strategic or political reasons, not for personal pleasure or exploration. Imagine the rarity of meeting new people from different regions or experiencing diverse cultures and ideas. Their social interactions were primarily with other noble families, often related by blood or marriage, reinforcing a narrow aristocratic worldview. Queens and great ladies, like Eleanor of Aquitaine, were exceptional for their extensive travels, but even their journeys were dictated by political necessity and were physically demanding ordeals. The lack of efficient communication further compounded this isolation. There were no postal services, no telephones, no internet. News traveled slowly, by word of mouth or by messenger, often taking weeks or months to reach distant locations. Imagine the anxiety of not knowing the fate of a loved one who had gone to war, or the difficulty of maintaining contact with family members who lived even a day's journey away. This meant that communities were largely self-contained, relying on internal resources and relationships. Women, often tasked with maintaining household stability, were deeply embedded in these local networks, their lives intricately woven into the small tapestry of their immediate surroundings. For women, this social isolation had profound implications. It meant a limited exposure to new ideas, different ways of life, or alternative perspectives. Their understanding of the world was often shaped by local superstitions, religious dogma, and the accepted norms of their immediate community. Their social support networks, while strong within the family, were intensely localized, offering little escape from personal disputes or difficult relationships within that small sphere. The very notion of individual choice or personal freedom was largely subsumed by the collective needs and rigid traditions of their constrained environment. The strictures on female mobility were also linked to safety concerns, as previously discussed. Dangers of travel in a lawless landscape, particularly for women, meant that their movements were often restricted and chaperoned. This further reinforced their insular existence. Their world was essentially their home, their village, and the immediate surroundings, with little to draw them beyond these familiar, yet confining, boundaries. This pervasive social isolation and limited mobility meant that for women in 1160, the world was a much smaller, more immediate, and far less diverse place than we can possibly imagine today.